Well, I just got here barely. I just flew in.
But you made it.
I did. I flew in from Phoenix today, where we did a lot of talk about these issues that Meredith and Nellie and Peggy just talked about. Really critically important to you guys to understand this, and important that legislators and politicians and regulators also figure this out. So let's start. I think this conference started with Anita Hill saying we need a leadership change fundamentally, or nothing's going to change, essentially. So let's start to talk about let's take the temperature of where you two are. Valerie, why don't we start with you?
Where am I?
Yeah.
On needing a leadership change?
Yeah.
Yeah, we need one. I think we do. I mean, I think, look, until we have enough voices that look like us at the table with the perspectives that we all share, then it's going to be very hard to force change. And one of the many lessons I learned in Washington, Sally, how many of you agree with this, is the strangled hold that there is on the status quo. And the only thing that changes the status quo is when enough people put pressure on the status quo to make a difference. And so that's what I think we all should be doing. We should be lifting up our voices, we should be speaking out, we should be voting, and we should be pushing to make sure that there is more representation of the rich diversity of our country at the table where the decisions are being made.
Well, where do you feel we are right now?
Oh, we're in a very bad place right now. I mean, but I'll say two things. One, I was heartened by the midterm elections to see so many women, an unprecedented number of women who were elected. I wish that we had a Congress that was comprised of 50% women when Sally and I were in the administration. I know we would have gotten more done. Just by definition, we would have gotten more done. I'm heartened that there's 6 women who are running for president, all of them qualified, and I think that's also historic and unprecedented. But I am worried, and I'll say one more thing, just picking up on what we were hearing earlier. I am heartened to see that there are more business leaders who understand the business imperative of diversity being a strength. And that is good, and that is different than it was certainly when I started working. So there are some signs of progress, but I think politically we are in a whole lot of trouble, and we better make some changes.
Sally?
You know, I think if there's a silver lining out of what's gone on for the last couple of years, and you got to work really hard to find the silver lining, but if there is one, I think, is that you do see women engaged in a whole different way than you saw just 4 or 5 years ago. And not just, I mean, obviously the number of women running for office has increased, significantly, but it's not just that. When we talk about a leadership change, it's not just the President of the United States or who's in the Senate or who's in those top spots. It's also who's influencing them. You talk about business leaders, you talk about women who are getting involved in political campaigns, if not the candidate themselves, women who are more involved in public office and public life. That, I think, is shifting, in part because sort of the thought is we're just not going to sit around and let other people define this anymore.
Except we are just sitting around and letting people define us. Right now, for example, let's talk about Alabama, reproductive rights. Were you surprised by that? I get that, but what were you surprised by this? Because it was very quickly.
I think that there have been folks who have been laying the groundwork for this for a very long time. I think if you look at the people who've been appointed to the court, both at the district, appellate, and Supreme Court level, they have been hoping for a good test case to try to reverse Roe versus Wade. But I will tell you, I remember being around when Roe versus Wade was passed, and I knew people who got abortions before they were able to get them legally. And I think maybe I even just kind of took it for granted as well, that this would always be the law, until recently, when I've been watching very closely the appointments that have been made. And look, when we were there, you couldn't get people to be excited about judicial appointments as a political issue. You ought to be concerned about it right now. Everybody should be concerned who believes a woman should have a right to choose. And I do think, and I'm actually more interested in what Sally has to say about this legally than what I have to say, but I think Alabama is a very bad test case for them. I think they could lose that one. But there are examples all around the country now where states are adopting new restrictions on a woman's right to choose in the hopes of finding that perfect test case to take it up to the Supreme Court.
Sally, why don't we talk about
women weren't just sitting around in Alabama when there was a Senate race, though,
Right.
because but for women in Alabama, we would have an accused child molester in the Senate right now, and more specifically, but for African-American women
Right.
Exactly.
in Alabama. That's who would be in our Senate.
So talk about what's happening there, and also in Georgia, where you live. You live part of the time in Georgia.
My home's in Atlanta. Yeah.
Right. Talk about that, both states. What is the legal, where is the path right now?
Yeah, I think Valerie is right. The statute that they passed in Alabama is so extreme, there is a pretty good chance that it will be reversed, but that's pretty cold comfort for the women of Alabama right now who need reproductive health there and don't have the ability to be able to get it. It's also a heck of a thing that it almost feels Handmaid's Tale-like in the sense of it.
You can take off almost, but go ahead.
Okay, that we go from where we are or maybe where we were to something that extreme, and people don't seem to be outraged about it. Of course, you look at the photos of sort of the signing of the law, and you see a lot of old white guys there. So
What's
maybe
the
we shouldn't
legal
be so
path
shocked.
right now, including Georgia, which
Yeah.
is the other
Right.
state?
Georgia's has not actually been implemented yet.
Right.
So in terms of standing for people to challenge it, it would not be until it's implemented. There's all sorts of issues going on with businesses threatening to pull out of Georgia. Oddly enough, there's a big movie business in Georgia. And actually, Stacey Abrams just went to California to try to convince them to stay.
Yes, I was
sort
just-
of stay
gonna
and
ask
fight.
that.
Yeah, instead of just leaving, because then you don't really have the same kind of economic pressure.
I just interviewed Stacey 2 nights ago
Did you?
at
Yeah,
a code conference
yeah.
with Lauren Groh, who was
Yeah,
the
who's-
campaign
yeah.
manager. And they are pushing the idea of not boycotting because it doesn't really help the situation. It attacks the people that it's meant not to.
Although I do think it's good that CEOs are getting engaged and involved. I mean, this began, I can remember when Mark Benioff at Salesforce threatened to pull out of Indiana. It's a wake-up call when
Yeah.
business leaders start to say, we care about these issues and our people care about these issues. So yes, we would lose a lot of jobs if they pulled out, but I think it's good that these CEOs are actually lifting up their voices.
Like you saw in the North Carolina bathroom bill. I mean, when you saw the
Same thing.
reaction to that, I think that's what helped move the needle.
Well, her concept is that let's just vote people out of office. So let's talk about that. Like, how do you get to that point? Because a lot of these things will continue to be chipped away at, whatever issue it happens to be and whatever issue President Trump's base is interested in. Where do you look at the political landscape right now? Valerie, you were in politics forever, and it was an enormous shift from President Obama to President Trump.
Well, I did, obviously a lot of soul searching after the election as I was going through the stages of grief, many all on the same day. And,
You all,
trying to figure out
remember the photo from the White House.
Yeah.
It was like a
that was taken the day after the election. And what was odd about the photo is that I saw the cameras, and so that was the best face I could put on. And now I look at it and I was like, girl, you could have done better than that. But it did capture how we all felt.
But
So
it was also a very
devastating.
diverse photo. It was,
Well, there it
it
was
was a
a-
really diverse photo, all incredibly depressed.
It reflected the diversity of our country, which President Obama thought his cabinet and his staff should do. But I think where I ended up after I was trying to figure out what the hell happened was 43% of eligible voters did not vote in the presidential election. Well, shame on you. You cannot complain about what happens if you don't participate in the most fundamental responsibility of our democracy. Well, it was a wake-up call, and the first evidence of that was the day after the inauguration, to Sally's point, when you saw so many women come out in the Women's March, outraged by the outcome of the election. And you've seen a lot of activism since then, those young people from Parkland and their activism around reducing gun violence and the Me Too movement, Time's Up. I think women's voices are now at a very important decibel. And the question is, can we continue that through the next election? And I say, don't pay attention to any polls right now that show you where any Democratic candidate is, because you know what? President Obama was down by about 30 points at this time in 2007. And the last thing we can afford is to say, well, this won't happen again, because you know what? It jolly well will if we don't get out and get engaged. And one of the ways that I'm trying to affect the outcome isn't actually even partisan. Mrs. Obama and I started an organization called When We All Vote. And it's designed to change the culture around voting, particularly for young people who have the most to lose, actually, and who vote in the disproportionately lowest level. So that's my solution, is to try to get some activism around voter turnout. And it's one thing to demonstrate, and it's one thing to protest, and it's one thing to be engaged. It's another thing to actually show up at the polls and vote.
So what is that? What is the problem with that? How do you engage people?
It's a retail politics. It's one-on-one. It's getting people influencers who people who do not vote might listen to get out there and encourage them. There are lots of organizations around the country who do voter registration and turnout, and what our organization is trying to do is to help mobilize them, give them some support from the most popular woman in the country, Mrs. Obama, and to really do it over and over and over again. And what worries me about the symptom of not voting is that I think people are beginning to shun institutions in general. And you've got your community defined in the palm of your hand, and it's like, well, what do I need with geography, or what do I need with feeling affiliated to any party, and I do believe democracy relies in large part on institutions, and government is a really important one, and not just who's the president. Who's on your city council? Who's on your school board? Who's in your state legislature drawing the lines that determine your voice in terms of your representation? And some of it is just a civics lesson. People don't know. They don't appreciate the impact that government has on their lives, that institutions have on their lives, and we have to educate them. And the burden is on those who do get it to use their voices to try to make that impact.
So Sally, you obviously showed that, the burden of your job by being fired.
The privilege.
The privilege. How do you look at it since then with these institutions? You were obviously still close to people at the Justice Department. The Justice Department seems a little different since you were there.
You could say that.
Yeah, so say it.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that is actually the most damaging thing that's happening right now. I mean, we can look at a lot of the policies I disagree with, if not 100%, like 99.5 of them. But it's the damage and ripping apart at the fabric of institutions and norms that is hard to sort of figure out how we put all that back together again. And it's become so normalized now that, we've lost our ability to be shocked by these things.
It's meant to be exhausting.
Just
the way social media
yeah.
is meant to be. It's meant to exhaust and make you deflated so that you have the 20th time that they cheat, you're like, oh, they're cheating again. Yesterday, President Trump said he didn't include, but he would if he could. I think that's what he said, essentially.
That was the gist of it, yeah.
Yeah, could you explain that for everyone, why that's a problem?
If I could explain that, I would worry about myself if I understood that. I mean, sort of where did the basic loyalty to our country go? And he has said this in such a way, I don't know if it was just on the heels of Don Jr.'s testimony or sort of what prompted this, but sometimes it feels like he says outrageous things intentionally to numb us so that then when the next outrageous thing happens, when you compare them, it's really sort of not so different. This is, I would say it's a stunning thing, but can we be stunned anymore? That he would say.
Explain the actual law. The actual law is you don't collude with foreign powers, I believe, correct?
Right, or you don't conspire. Collusion is not actually a crime. Conspiracy is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you
Yeah, so you don't, we have, and I'll try not to get sort of wonky lawyer-like here, but we have really specific rules about not allowing foreign countries to influence our elections. And so when it even comes to campaign contributions, that's prohibited from foreign nationals. So here, what you have is something far worse than that. It was a foreign adversary who was attempting to influence the election and to work in a way to benefit Donald Trump and to hurt Hillary Clinton. And none of this is what I'm saying, by the way, is controversial. It's all right there in the Mueller report if you read it. And what Mueller found was that the campaign readily was happy to accept assistance on some occasions, and the Russians were happy to give it. There just wasn't a meeting of the minds for them to necessarily work together for that. And so his report actually even found that at times the campaign timed actions that they were going to take based upon what the Russians were going to do, and specifically with the release of Hillary Clinton's emails. Sure sounds like collusion to me, but collusion's not a crime. And so that's sort of, but conspiracy is.
So he can collude all he wants, correct?
No. I think even his own FBI director said, you get a call from a foreign government, particularly a foreign adversary, who wants to assist your campaign. What you ought to be doing is calling the FBI. It seems almost quaint now when you think back to Al Gore, when he got, the video and the campaign materials that were sent to him, and rather than watching it or reviewing that stuff, he sends it back and contacts the FBI.
Yeah. So let's talk about how we then get that. So we're in this state of somewhat lawlessness, but sort of close to the line lawlessness, not quite there. People wanted you to run for office. How do we get people to run for office? You do not want to run for office, is that correct?
No.
Because your husband wants you to run for office.
Yeah. See, this is the problem when you've talked to Kara before. She knows some of this stuff, so you can't,
You're a good example. You're appealing.
Well, thank you. Yeah. You're appealing too,
Yes.
Kara?
Why don't you run for office?
No.
Yeah, thank you, Valerie.
No,
yeah, take the heat off of me.
No. I'm not even slightly appealing, because as they said at the beginning of this, I don't smile on a daily basis.
No, I think that there,
What's the calculation? Here's someone you've been approached. Same thing with Stacey Abrams, not running yet.
Yeah, I think that there are other ways to perform public service other than necessarily running for elected office. And look, I hope that maybe someday I get a chance to do that again. And look, if sort of the right office and I was really drawn to it was there, maybe I would, but it's not anything I really feel. And I think people who do that have generally kind of like always known they wanted to run for office. They've sort of structured their lives around it. That's what they want to, it's just sort of not me.
Okay. All right, so how, Valerie, do we get people to run more? How do we get more representation? There was a great deal in the midterm election.
She gave up, I love that.
I know, I'm starting to work on it.
I haven't actually given up on
Yeah.
on Sally running yet, but I do respect the fact that
There's a senator job open.
There's more than one way to make an impact, yeah, and you do have to have the fire in your belly or you shouldn't do it. And I think the good news is there are a lot more women who do have that fire in their belly and who are putting their name in the arena. And I think our job is to encourage them. And part of what I'm interested in doing is helping create a platform where people get the tools that they need, so if they have that inkling that they want to do it, that they know how to do it. And there are organizations like that just cropped up, like Run for Something, where, thank God Amanda Littman got off her couch after she was devastated from the last election and got busy helping women run for office. And I just was in Minneapolis. There's an organization called Women Winning where they support pro-choice women. And there are a whole lot of them that are elected in Minnesota. And so I think there are lots of ways that we can encourage women to do it. And again, that can be retail as well. I talk to anybody who says they have an inkling that they want to run. But I also think Sally's point is an important one. And President Obama, when he left office, said he's returning to the most important office of all, and that's the office of citizen. And there's so much we can all do in service, whether you're in government full-time or whether you're volunteering within an organization that you care about. And that activism and involvement and engagement, I'm worried that we might lose if we don't support it and get people to engage and get people to appreciate that when you do that, you get out of it so much more than you give.
So explain steps to do that, because it's not just representation of women, it's people of color, it's marginalized communities. There was a big spate of that, obviously, in the midterm elections.
And that was good, and it was organic. Look, it comes from people who have the fire in their belly, and then other people who help empower them. And you're seeing it right now in the presidential run.
Well, we'll get
record number of women who are running for office.
How do you assess the women who won, especially from AOC on down, who are running?
They are shaking things up. They are disruptors. And you don't have to agree with everything they say to support their right to say it. And recognize, right? And shaking things up in that institution of Congress is what we need. And it's interesting watching, now I think AOC is tweeting with Ted Cruz. Is it Cruz or Rubio? Is it Rubio? I love seeing them going back and forth. And you know what? Let me tell you, the Republican establishment is frantic about that. The thought that somebody who's defined as being on the far left would be reaching out to somebody on the right, but that is what we need to see in Washington. That's the kind of behavior we need to model, and she's not letting them define her, putting her in a box. She's showing, yeah, I'm willing to work across the aisle, and I think that's what we need more of, and when we see that behavior, we should be supporting it.
So politics via Twitter.
No, not politics via Twitter. The point I'm making is politics via engagement. We're saying I can talk to somebody who I might disagree with on 99.9% of the issues, but if we can find something to agree with, I'm willing to work with them. And that is disruptive, because that's not the status quo that was there for the 8 years that I had the privilege of working in the White House. Then we had people who were willing to put their short-term political interests ahead of what's good for the country at almost any cost. Just think about it. We were about to default on our full faith and credit that would have disrupted world economic markets over whether or not we would repeal the Affordable Care Act. And we were not going to have a budget over whether we were going to. We had a shutdown over taking health care away from Americans. How crazy is that?
Crazy.
It's crazy.
It's crazy.
Crazy.
Crazy. So when you think about that,
Thank you.
the move towards partisanships, we're going to get to questions in a minute, move towards partisanships. How do you, because you would not strike me as a partisan person, but you've been made into a partisan person or seen as, oh, Sally Yates, because she...
Some people see her as a hero.
Exactly, of course, but I mean, that's how you're painted on by the right. I was like, her, me, sure, or Valerie, perhaps, but you. It's really interesting, the concept that this is how partisan it's gotten.
Yeah, it feels really weird, actually, because I was a career prosecutor for all of those years before I was appointed by President Obama, and certainly I've been a Democrat that whole time, but that's not how you define yourself and the job that you're doing there. It's truly a nonpartisan job, and even when you're in an appointed position, in a political position, it's not. So it feels really strange, but I think, unfortunately, some people just can't fathom that people make decisions other than through a partisan lens. And so because that's how they think, they feel the need to project that on you. And so if that's what they want to project, fine.
How do you counter that?
Well, I think what you've seen is there are a whole lot of folks out there, Democrats and Republicans, that are equally disturbed about the rule of law and the president's attacks on the rule of law and his attempt to intervene in the Justice Department. When you see, 1,000 prosecutors, Democrats and Republicans, who all sign a letter saying this is obstruction, that sort of, hopefully, if people are paying attention, then maybe that helps to dispel some of that notion. I just have a hard time having a good sense of how much of that sinks in. I mean, how much are people paying attention in that kind of granular fashion?
So let's talk about that, whether there's a whole debate around impeachment, about whether it should happen. Explain Nancy Pelosi's calculation. I think I understand what she's doing, but I'd love to hear from you.
Well, look, I haven't spoken to her about it. I will say one thing. She's a very shrewd leader, and I defer to her judgment. She knows her caucus better than anybody else. She's been there. She understands this president, and she has a good feel for the American people. And she does not think that it is time for that move. She's supportive of all these committee hearings. She's very supportive of transparency and getting people on the record and figuring out what in the heck happened there. And I think at this point, she's made the calculus that it's not something she wants to support.
What do you think?
I go along with her because nobody has better political instincts. And it is a political decision as to whether or not to bring impeachment, to begin impeachment hearings. That's a political decision.
Because it goes nowhere.
And in a sense, I think Bob Mueller punted and decided he didn't want to make a legal conclusion, although he did say if he could have exonerated the president, he would have. And that was a pretty profound statement that I don't know got as much attention as it should have. But whether or not to impeach the president is a political decision. And since I don't have a vote in Congress, my view, Kara, is what am I going to do? And what I'm going to do is go out and try to get as many people registered to vote as I can, because that's within my power. And so I don't spend a lot of time thinking about how somebody else should do their job in the Senate until it's time for me to vote and get other people to vote.
What do you
But don't you think a lot of people, in terms of not turning out to vote, that there's sort of a sense of, well, really nothing changes regardless of who you elect? I think we just got a really strong lesson that things do change based on who is sitting in the White House. And so I think that's part of why you saw the increased turnout, obviously, in the midterms, and I would be hopeful that would increase exponentially then for the next presidential election, too.
So let's end on the presidential election.
Okay.
Increase exponentially. There's a lot of women, but they're not polling as high, except for Elizabeth Warren is starting to move on up the numbers.
It's early.
It's early. How do you assess, there's all these women running, again, Kristen Gillibrand's at the bottom, Amy Klobuchar is sort of at the bottom, Marianne Williamson, I don't know where she is in the group, but there's a lot of women in the group, but Elizabeth Warren seems to be only, and Kamala Harris is quite low. How do you assess that?
The way I look at it is in 2007, Barack Obama at this point was about 30 points down in the primary race, and Hillary
From-
Clinton was the inevitable
Right.
nominee. And so it is early, and I think in this news cycle, everybody's trying to say, somebody asked me the other day, well, who's going to win the first debate? I said, why don't we wait and watch the debate and find out?
Right.
Why are you asking me that now? It's like, slow down, everybody, take a deep breath, give all of the candidates, well, first of all, we should be doing our homework. We should be looking at their record. We should be listening to what they're saying, and we should be looking at their temperament. I think temperament is actually very important. I want to see, how does a candidate take a punch that's fair? How does a candidate take a punch that's unfair? I want to see, how do they do 6 months in Iowa? It's hard, and I love Iowa, don't get me wrong, but let's see how their legs hold up under this marathon, because that's nothing compared to what I expect of them if he or she is elected president. So I say it's way too early to be even handicapping this race. Let's see how they do.
Even
Let's
though-
kick their tires
Go
and
ahead.
lift up their hood. Even though what?
Even though it's 3 men at the top, except Elizabeth Warren.
I wouldn't let that define where we are 6 months from now or a year from now.
Yeah, just because Pete Buttigieg is so adorable. But go ahead.
He is kind of a he's smart as a whip.
Yeah, he is. I have to interview him on Monday. I'm doing an interview, and I'm going to say, your charms do not work on the lesbian. Let's move on.
We'll see.
I do not.
I think those charms might.
I would like some policies out of him. That would be my preference.
I think you should push him on that.
I shall. I shall say either borrow them from Elizabeth Warren, because she's got plenty, or else come up with some of your own. But go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, to sort of state the obvious that's been said 1,000 times before, I do think women are held to a different standard in this. And you've read about sort of the likability quotient. You sure never really see that issue being bandied about so much with men. And so, I do think that there's still, women have another hoop to jump through to have everything balanced just right, so that people will find them authoritative enough but not threatening or, God forbid, shrill. All of those things that has to just be balanced exactly right for a woman.
But if you ask if our country is ready, I say absolutely. If everybody votes, I think we're absolutely ready for it. And look, people said, my parents said, the country will never elect a black man as long in their lifetime. And things seem impossible until they seem inevitable. And a lot of it just turns on us. Women we're half the population, we're half the workforce. We ought to get out there and vote. And I'm not saying you have to vote for a woman. I'm just saying you have to vote for somebody who's going to fight for your values and know what's important to you and your family and have your best interest at heart. And are they authentic and real? And I believe, which is why I don't talk too much about those who are running right now, because whoever emerges as the nominee in the Democratic Party will have my full support. And I don't want them to beat each other up so much in the primary that they go into the general election in a weakened state.
Yeah. What about you?
What's the
Do
question?
you support anyone in particular?
No,
Valerie's very,
no, we've got an abundance of riches right now.
Exactly.
So,
no one at all?
Look at the time.
You think if you ask a prosecutor twice, she's going to change her answer?
I'm going to do just 2 quick questions from the audience, I think. Is that right? Right here? 2 or 3.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much. It's fabulous to hear from you. I just wanted to ask, I totally agree with the importance of voting and the demonstrations that said this is not what democracy looks like the day after the election. I really want to yell at all of them and say, yeah, democracy was yesterday, where were you? So, but to the importance of voting, what about all the sort of structural things that make your vote not count? The gerrymandering, the electoral college, and frankly, judicial appointments, as you were talking about. So can you just talk to that a little bit?
Well, on the gerrymandering, we know Eric Holder is heading up a commission that's trying to look at the gerrymandering and going after states that are passing laws that are discriminatory and has had success doing that, and we should support his effort. But I guess the point I was trying to make is this. There are lots of states that are passing, not lots, there are states that are passing laws that are intended to suppress the vote, and they are directing them at young people and directing them at people of color. And we should fight that with all of the tools that we have in our toolkit. But let's not disenfranchise ourselves, which means if you have to stand in line for 5 hours, then I don't care, stand in line for 5 hours. And I remember in 2012, I went down to Florida. They had a ballot that was like 5 pages long, designed to suppress the vote. People were out there with their folding chairs and fried chicken and concerts going on because they were not going to allow themselves to be disenfranchised. And so, I give Sally an enormous amount of credit when she was in the Justice Department for trying to defend the Voting Rights Act, fighting against what the Supreme Court did when they held a portion of it unconstitutional, going after states that are suppressing the vote. But we as citizens have a lot that we can do. And so let's not disenfranchise ourselves.
Anything?
I can't say it any better than Valerie
Also
did.
voting machines.
Yeah.
Okay, one last question.
My name's Julia Taylor Kennedy. I work at a nonprofit called the Center for Talent Innovation that studies diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And something you said, Valerie, really struck a chord with me because over the past 15 years of our existence, we've seen an explosion in companies taking this really seriously and sort of raising their voices in public debate. So I'm curious what stands out to you, that either specific companies or specific actions that are particularly impactful in society.
Tone starts at the top, so creating a culture that is supportive of working families, for example. I said a few days ago, if you have a paid leave policy on your books and it's generous and nobody takes it, you don't have a paid leave policy. And so I know what we tried to do in both the White House and other places where I've worked is to set the tone from the top, to give people permission to take advantage of the provisions that you put in place that support working families. When we were in the White House, we asked employers to take an equal pay pledge and to commit that if they found a gap, that they would close the gap and get rid of the structural barriers that created the gap in the first place. And we asked them to do it voluntarily, and I was heartened to see the number of employers around the country who did that and who discovered a gap that they did not know exist. And so I think it's important that we look at workplace paid leave. We should have a national paid leave policy. It is outrageous that the United States is the only developed country in the world that doesn't have a national policy. But you know what? So employers need to do it on their own. And I was just at Spotify here in New York. Guess what they have? Because it's a Swedish company, but they employ a lot of Americans. They have 1 year of paid leave, same for men and for women, and you have 2 years to take it. My goodness. And you know what? They are hiring in droves. And people are taking it and going back. I met a woman who interviewed me who had just had her second child, and she said, I wouldn't leave Spotify for anything. I think we need more and more employers recognizing that investing in working families is a business imperative if you expect to be globally competitive. That's what I think.
All right. So this is the last panel day, and we're going to bring on Rebecca and Jess. But what is one thing each of these people could do? I tend to try to leave people depressed, but why don't you not do that? One thing.
You know, as exhausting as it is with sort of the barrage that comes in to all of us every day, it's to not allow yourself to become numb to lies. An indifference to truth, I think, is going to live with us a lot longer than any of the policies or anything else will.
I think we have to recognize that our voices make a difference. And part of why I wanted to come here today is, I read the New York Times every day, but more important than that, I recognize, and it was just great to see Maggie here earlier, and I said, you know what? We are behind you. I think we have to support the media. And, at a time like this, they are really under attack. And I was heartened to hear them say that it doesn't bother them, but I have to believe that there are a lot of people who are worried about their safety and their families.
Yep.
And so when I say your voices matter, use your megaphone that you have and recognize the empowerment that your voice and the power that your voice can carry. And so use it effectively and use it to be a force for good and support those individuals and those institutions that you hold dear.
Thank you. Valerie, Jarrett, Sally Yates.
Thank you.
Thank you.